Okay, so I'll get started. Hello, everyone. So my name is Elisa Martinez, and I am an event staffer at Politics and Prose Bookstore. And I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. So we appreciate you joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we've been working really hard to bring you the authors you love and the new books and their new books to our PNP community. So at any point during the event, you can click on the link, which will be posted in the chat, to purchase the Empathy Diaries on the Politics and Prose website. So if you'll look near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. So you can click there to submit any questions that you have to the author. So we try our best to get to everyone's questions, but apologies in advance if we run out of time before we get to yours. So we will also be providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen. So before we begin, I just want to say thank you again for being here. We're immensely grateful for you all helping keep our business and spirits afloat. And now I would like to welcome to PNP Live, Sherry Turkle, celebrating the release of her book, The Empathy Diaries. So Sherry Turkle is the Abby Rockefeller Mosé Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT and the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. A licensed clinical psychologist, she's the author of 6 books, including Alone Together and New York Times bestseller Reclaiming Conversation, as well as the editor of 3 collections. So a Miss Magazine Woman of the Year, TED speaker, and feature media commentator. She's a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So in the Empathy Diaries, Turkle ties together her coming of age and her path-breaking research on technology, empathy, and ethics. Growing up in post-war Brooklyn, Turkle searched for clues to her identity in a house filled with mysteries. She mastered the codes that governed her mother's secretive life. She learned to never ask about her absent scientist father and never to use his name, her name. Before empathy became a way to find connection, it was her strategy for survival. And Dr. Turkle will be joined in conversation with Alan Lightman. Alan Lightman is an American writer, physicist, and social entrepreneur. Lightman has served on the faculties of Harvard and MIT. In his scientific research, he has made fundamental contributions to the astrophysics of black holes and cosmic radiative processes. He is currently the professor of the practice of humanities at MIT. He's the author of numerous books, one of which is now being made into a PBS series, so keep an eye out for that. So please join me in welcoming Sherry Turkle and Alan Lightman to PNP Live.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Politics and Prose, for inviting me to join the wonderful Sherry Turkle. Sherry has written a beautiful memoir about her life growing up in a poor Jewish family in Brooklyn and the forces that shaped her, and eventually becoming a leading thinker in the culture of the internet. There might not even have been a culture of the internet before Sherry Turkle got involved. I'm personally impressed by the emotional honesty of the book, as well as the compelling portraits of family members, psychologists, AI experts, and other people who played a role in her life. So we have a lot to talk about. And perhaps we can start with the title of the book. Why empathy in the title?
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody who's joined us here today. It's really a pleasure to be interviewed by Alan, who is a colleague and a friend, and whose work dovetails with mine in so many really interesting ways. I'm really looking forward to this. And empathy is a great place to start because I noticed as I looked over my career, and this book was meant to be a book that explained the passion behind my career. I'd always wanted to read a book where someone put together the emotional connection between their personal life and their professional life. People so often write their intellectual biographies as though they were just so fascinated with these ideas. And I knew that my ideas were really lit from within. And the theme of so much of my work on technology is that technology contrives to have an assault on empathy, not because there's somebody with a master plan, but because technology wants things to be friction-free. That's the value of technology. Technology says, we give you something compelling. I'm picking up a phone. And we give you something so compelling that your eyes should be down on it rather than looking at the person you're speaking with. And we know from studies that I and others have done that takes away, that lack of eye contact, takes away from the empathic connection with another person. So many of the things I've studied turned out to be about the way in which technology undermines empathy. And in my own life, the capacity for empathy, which I was not shown as a child, but which I had to fight hard to get for myself and develop the capacity for, and to learn how to operate in a world of empathy, because for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into, empathy was not shown to me in very crucial ways. I realized that the thing that I had been missing as a child became the thing that I was so sensitive to when I saw the technology itself could undermine that. So my work really, as I said, was kind of lit from within, because it wasn't a job, it was really a passion.
You mentioned that the technology separates us from emotion. Maybe separate is not the right verb, but contrasts or squashes emotion. Do you think it would be possible to, in the future, to build an AI or an android that had all of the attributes of emotion?
Well, no. I mean, and here's how I would put my position on this. What the Turing test was, brilliant Alan Turing, writing in the 40s and 50s, proposed was that if a computer could fool you into thinking it was a person, it was intelligent. And what roboticists and the inventors of chatbots are trying to propose today is, if a computer can pretend well enough to convince you that it has empathy, that it has emotion, well, then it's emotional, then it has empathy. Now, it turns out that it wasn't hard for computers to, in certain domains, to pass the Turing test and to convince us that they had intelligence. And now we're coming upon artificial intimacy, where computers are pretending that they know how to pretend that they have an emotional life. But just because something can pretend that it cares about you, that it knows how to ask after your emotions, does not mean that it knows what pain is, knows what the fear of death is, knows what it is to have a child and feel an attachment to that child. So you're seeing better and better as if representations of emotion, startling sometimes in their verisimilitude. But that's not the same as that object really knowing what it is to have that feeling or that attachment.
Yes, I completely get your point about the difference between pretending and actually reality. reality versus pretend reality. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment, and then I'd like to get back to your personal biography. But
Sure.
there are a number of serious computer scientists who believe that consciousness. Let's go deeper than emotion and start with the fundamental human experience of being in the world, consciousness.
Yeah.
There are a number of leading computer scientists, for example, Christoph Koch, who feel that consciousness does not have to be rooted in biology, that you could create a computer, and you could put it in the form of an android if you wanted, that had all of the, it had enough connections. I mean, we think that the consciousness or intelligence comes from the connections between neurons in the brain, but it would have enough complexity that it would begin thinking, it would be able to think, it would be able to learn, it would have all of the attributes that we associate with consciousness. And if that could occur, then I could imagine that such a conscious being, whether it was rooted in silicon or carbon-based neurons, would be able to exhibit emotion. So that's the hypothesis.
Yes, but I'm granting you that it could exhibit. What I'm saying, let me tell you a story. During the pandemic, I'm granting you that it could exhibit. I'm granting you that it could perform in the most complex way. And I want to tell you a story. During the pandemic, I was living alone, and I was called by a New York Times reporter who was studying a chatbot that a lot of people were using as a psychotherapist. And he called me for a comment, and I said, listen, you're calling me because you're looking for a negative quote, right? He says, yes, right. I said, no, I want to really talk to this chatbot. I want to get right in there and have a conversation with this chatbot therapist. So he gave me the link, and I had to create an avatar that I would be most likely to relate to as a therapist. I created a middle-aged woman who would talk to me about my problems. And on day one, I set up our session, and I say, look, I want to talk about loneliness. Are you able to talk to me about loneliness? Because my anxieties at that point were over the top. It was just at the beginning of the pandemic. There was no vaccine. I was reading about people my age. You know, I had gone from being like the best person in my cycling class to being like the person most likely in the age group to be intubated. I mean, I was over the top with anxiety. So I said, I'm anxious about all the, about being alone, about saying goodbye to people I love. I'm seeing people say goodbye on screens. I'm anxious about death. Can you talk about loneliness? Absolutely. So I said, well, where should we start? And the chatbot says to me, loneliness is warm and fuzzy. It was a glitch. It was a programming error. It was a mistake. It was corrected the next day because it was just like a crazy glitch, because this thing was very smart. I took a screenshot. I mailed it back to the New York Times guy. I said, look, why should this thing, it was a mistake. It was an honest mistake. It was fixed the next day. The point is that I needed to talk to somebody who was afraid of death, who had a child, who knew what it was to have raised a child, who knew what it was to cough at night and wonder if that was the wrong cough. I mean, I had a thing I put on my finger to see what my blood oxygenation was. I never did those things before. I needed something with a body, with a history, with a child who was in there. That's what I'm talking about. To understand who we are. I'm not interested if they can create something complex enough that it can simulate a complex emotional state.
I'm not talking about simulation. I'm talking about the actual production of consciousness.
But Alan, I'm sorry to just insist, it's not going to be nervous about its
right
oxygen level.
So what I hear you saying, and I think it's a very valid argument, that no matter what we create in AI, and even if we create something that is conscious in all definitions of consciousness, that it will not have lived human experience, that thing that we create. And so all of the examples that you mentioned, having a child, having a headache, so on, that's lived human experience. And that will forever be a distinction between the artificial things that we create and real people walking around.
Yeah, and so I say, and I think it's a very, reasonable position, is that create these great things, let them do great things, let them explore planets, let them explore dangerous, I'm not trying to stop the expansion of a field of inquiry, but what's with us? What's with us that we want to make them our emotional dialogue partners? Why have we, I think it says something more about our not wanting to be vulnerable to each other. I mean, I'm not against creating machines may have their own anxieties. Machines may have, who knows what kind of emotional lives machines will have.
They might be afraid that
like to be a machine.
Yeah,
but
they might be afraid on.
Yeah. Excuse me, Alan. They may have their own. It'll be fascinating to see what emotional anxieties machines have, if you want to use that kind of word. But they're not going to have the emotional anxiety of my fearing I'm going to say goodbye to my daughter on a Microsoft Surface. That's for sure. And so when I want to talk to a psychotherapist, or if I want to talk to a counselor, I want to talk to somebody who understands that. Anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I think, for so many other applications, there's so many other wonderful things that robots can do, and I'm just all for it.
Well, that's a very compelling stand that you have. I was interested when I asked you about why empathy in the title, and you said that growing up that you did not have empathy around you, and that sort of led you into your professional occupation. Can you tell us a little bit about your family life growing up and why you did not have empathy there?
Yes, it was a very particular configuration, which I think a robot would have a hard time understanding. My mother was married to a man named Charles Zimmerman, who was my biological father. And when I was 1 year old, she left him. And she went to live with her parents, Robert and Edith Bonowitz, and her sister, her unmarried sister, Mildred Bonowitz, who lived in Brooklyn in a 1-bedroom apartment. I slept between, she took me and left. I slept between my grandparents. My mother and aunt slept on a pull-out sofa in the living room. We each had one drawer in a dresser. It was very little space. And I was part of this Bonowitz clan. I was never to mention my father's name. I couldn't see him, and we literally never discussed him. I understood, I was very bright, and I understood from zero that this was absolutely taboo. And so there was the lie. And when she remarried a man named Milton Turkle. And long before he actually legally adopted me when I was a teenager, I, all through my school years, had to lie about my name and say I was Sherry Turkle to all my friends and my Girl Scout troop, and even though my name was Sherry Zimmerman. So I had like this double life. I was like a secret agent. I had these lies. I had no idea why. We couldn't discuss it. But I also had this tremendous love from all of these people. So it wasn't like a bunch of creeps and sons of bitches who were asking me to lie. There were these people who were devoted to me and supported and loved me, who made me really the center of their lives.
So where was the lack of empathy? Where was the lack of empathy?
Total lack of empathy of what it would be like to ask a child to say they had no last name. For a while, I had no last name. People thought my name was kind of Bonowitz somehow. I never even saw my name written out until I started school. They could not. It was as though they could not have empathy with what that was like for me. And so it was that combination of that lack of empathy. But I'm trying to say it was coupled with this love, the lies and the love that turned me into somebody who made myself the kind of Nancy Drew detective of my life, to try to figure out, to be empathic with them. What could possibly be on their minds to do such a thing to me? What could possibly be their motivations? What possible story could be behind this story? And I had all kinds of theories, wrong theories, crazy theories, but it was kind of my life's work to figure out the psychology of these people. And I think that's why I became a psychologist, because from the earliest days, trying to figure out, listen attentively to other people's conversations, try to pick up clues, was kind of what I did for a living as a baby. So yeah, empathy became really a survival skill before it became a way to connect with other people.
There were a number of men in your professional and personal life that you talk about in the book. They're the AI experts, Seymour Papert, you were married to him, Marvin Minsky,
Right.
Psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, sociologist David Reisman. And I think that you imply in the book, and I might be, reading something in that's not there, that most of these men had overeducated brains and underdeveloped emotions. Can you add a little? I might be missing the boat there, but I sort of got that.
It's a nice, pretty good.
So can you add a little depth to that description?
Well, my favorite Marvin Minsky story, and I'll let our listeners decide if you're how to think about it, is that Marvin Minsky was a great figure in artificial intelligence and a devoted family man. I mean, he loved his family. He was deeply attached to his family. And when Tron came out, I think that was like in maybe 77, 78, something around there, this movie that imagined the mind as a society of programs, which was really important for Marvin Minsky because he was involved in a theory that saw the mind as a society of programs in his artificial intelligence work. And I went with him to see along with, not just me, but along with 100 other students, to see and colleagues, to see the Boston debut of Tron. And as we come out, he looks at me and he says, well, what did you think? And I said, well, it was really interesting. It's just like your theory. I mean, the movie is like an embodiment of your theory. And he says to me, people should see this movie, children should see this movie and they should never see Bambi. Bambi should be outlawed for children, and they should just see this movie. And I went, of course, I had seen Bambi as a child and loved it, and I went for the bait. I should never have jumped to the bait. And I said, why? What's wrong with Bambi? And he said, because in Bambi, children learn to love and attach to their mothers. But when there's artificial intelligence and artificial life, we will be raised by robots who will care for us, and there will be no mothers, there will be no death, and children should not learn about that death is important, or that mothers are important, or that attachment is important. Words came out of Marvin Minsky's mouth. Now, so when I laughed when you said overdeveloped theories of mind and underdeveloped theories of
emotions, yeah.
I said, well, that's pretty good for Marvin Minsky, except, and I think it's very important for the people who are listening to this, who were listening to this story about my book and what I tried to make of people in this world, to listen to this following thought. Marvin Minsky didn't treat his family that way, as though he was a kind of intellectual bystander to their lives. My husband, Seymour Papert, was a close friend of Marvin Minsky. And when Seymour Papert, my husband, needed back surgery, Marvin Minsky, who was attached to Seymour, was at Seymour's side, was at Seymour's bedside at Mass General every morning before the place opened up, with special foods and special gadgets and special puzzles to amuse him if he was, to just make everything about his recuperation and his eating. I mean, they were both foodies, and he brought him Chinese foods that he had flown in. I mean, I don't even know what he brought him. The point is that his actual attachment and connection to people was not at all like this theory. Mm-hmm. So there's something about, and I think this is very important to think about as we consider the people who talk this talk, and actually, do they mean it? Or what kind of discourse is this? I have found, and this is a great puzzlement to me, and I try to really express this in the book, that sometimes the people who are most adamant about our robot overlords and how we are going to mate with them and love them and hang with them are the most attached to their lives and their intimate lives as people. So
yeah,
I'm a little, I'm not sure if a little bit this isn't a game in some way, but I it's a question I raise in the book. I found my life at MIT to raise more questions than it answers about this question. But I will say, I think you're playing on dangerous ground when you just say, oh, well, I'll just create a robot babysitter for children. I wouldn't want it really for my kid, but no harm in my creating it for everybody else's kid. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe a way to answer.
Okay, so it's complicated, and there might be
very complicated.
Yes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your work in the area of virtual reality, and in fact, the titles of two of your books, Life on the Screen being one, and Alone Together being another, I think convey some of the essential ideas just in the title themselves, which means that they're very good titles. So what have we lost in our virtual world?
Well, let me first say that when I wrote Alone Together, which is a book that I wrote when the first virtual realities were being developed, the MUDs and the MOOs, the MUDs were multi-user dungeons, they were called, and then they developed into more elaborate things like Second Life, where you could actually create an avatar and live in a virtual space And now it's the kind of thing that's blossoming into what people are calling the metaverse. Much more elaborate, your avatar will be more elaborate, etc. That's what I studied in this book, Life on the Screen, the first iteration of that. And people would go online and create a younger and thinner version of themselves. Sometimes they would switch gender and experiment with what it would be to be a man or a woman, to kind of do it other way. But a lot of the time, they just wanted to be younger, thinner, and taller. A different body, better hair, better wardrobe. Women were glad to be able to be men sometimes because they felt they, had more
Power.
Presence in meetings, more power. There were these, I called it an identity workshop. There was a lot of experimentation and people really learned something about themselves. And so in the first instance, I had a lot of very good things to say about what you could learn about yourself, or we could all learn about ourselves in virtual reality. But then I began to notice things that gave me pause. And that give me pause now as this experiment begins, where people are really considering, well, why don't we work there? Why don't we spend most of our day there? Why don't we really decamp? Why don't we hold this whole conversation in avatar to avatar? And the thing that we lose is that magic of, and we lose it a little bit on Zoom, but we still have some of it, of the vulnerability of our physical presence, the eye contact, the mirror neurons in our face. We are wired as human beings to make minute adjustments, to actually feel in our faces, in our bodies, to have our musculature mirror the musculature of the person we're talking to, so that when you frown a little bit, I begin to frown and I almost shape my response to trying to get in tune with the conversation you want to have. Not to please you, but to connect with you. It's how empathy becomes the defining human, I don't want to say virtue, I want to say capacity. Because we are literally hardwired to do this. Now, why would we want to give that up so that I can go online as a Marilyn Monroe looking person? I'm 5'4". My Marilyn Monroe self will certainly be 5'10". She certainly will not have any of my wrinkles, or, she'll just be very different. We'll lose that vulnerability. Already we text instead of talk in my research because we want to lose that vulnerability. I wrote a book on conversation and how people flee conversation. And when I ask people, why do you not want to have a conversation? What's wrong with conversation? They tell me, because it takes place in real time and you can't control what you're going to say. You can't leave at any time you want. Well, the danger of this metaverse, the danger of virtual reality is that we lose our vulnerability to each other. We lose what makes us human. We lose our empathic connection. And, really, what's the point of life for somebody like me who thinks this is what makes life worth living? So that's my problem.
It seems to me that there's a paradox here, or an irony, that a lot of people say that the internet helps us connect with more people and more of the world because we can do it on the screen. And yet you're describing a situation in which we actually have less connection with people. So isn't that kind of an irony?
No, we have more connection, less conversation.
More connection, less conversation.
Yeah, in other words, it was really funny when Alone Together came out. I was interviewed by Stephen Colbert, who's really a genius, and he put it this way to me. I've never forgotten it all these years. He said, "Don't all those little sips of connection lead up to one big gulp of conversation? Don't all those little sips of connection, isn't that the same as a big gulp of conversation? Because you have all these multiple sips of connection when you're on the internet." And it was the greatest way to put it. And I said, no.
Yeah.
The 1,000 sips of connection is not worth one conversation. It's not the same thing. And if I had a choice, I mean, it is such a pleasure to see your face, to see your reaction, to see, if I had a choice of going online as a different creature and not seeing, I mean, it's not even close. It's, and I think it would be better face to face, but this is very nice. I mean, this feels very connected. We've learned how to do this better. I can't imagine why we would want to
live on the screen.
Choose to do this as an avatar.
Let me look.
Cafe, in a pretend French cafe, so we could pretend we were in Paris. I mean,
Let me look into the future, and a couple of minutes we'll open this up for Q&A.
Yeah.
So I want to look into the future, but first, before looking in the future, I want to go into the past a bit. And you probably know this, but the first recombinant DNA occurred in 1972. There was a biologist at Stanford named Paul Berg, and he produced the first hybrid organism by injecting the DNA of one organism into a second organism, creating something that had never existed before in nature. And when word got out that he had done this, there were a number of biologists around the world who got alarmed that we may be creating something very dangerous. And there was this very unusual conference of biologists in 1975 called the Asilomar Conference, in which biologists got together and they discussed the possibility of drawing some guidelines for the development of recombinant DNA going forward. Should we have any guidelines like that for the development of virtual reality? Because we're, Mark Zuckerberg and others with the metaverse are galloping ahead. Should we worry? Should we worry in the same way that the biologists were worrying about recombinant DNA? Should we be worried, and should we have any restraints?
Well, I'm concerned about two groups. I'm concerned about children. I'm concerned about children above all. I'm not concerned about children and screen time. I'm concerned about children and robot companions. A child who's being asked to form a primary emotional relationship with a companion that has no inner life, that cannot relate to them as an empathic human being, is you're playing with fire. You put that child into the metaverse where they don't know who they're relating to. They could be relating to robots. I mean, so many of the people you meet in virtual reality are not people at all, but chatbots, are but a version of a robot. And children who are, and again, this argument that I come across all the time, and I think should be much more widely discussed among psychologists and philosophers. I think go at it, that if you can't tell the difference, why does it matter? That is the argument that I get all the time seeing somebody say, please consult Clara and the Sun. There's a lot of literature now. There's a lot of films, and there's a lot of, imaginative things that really is quite pro-robot. I just want to point that out to everybody, that we're in a robotic moment where the culture is more and more turning to the idea that if it behaves like a person, sort of like Dayenu, it's like, enough, it's good enough. And I'm making another argument, which is, let's think that through again. Let's think through again, what are the implications for our humanity if we content ourselves in intimate relationships with objects that really don't understand our inner life as a human being would, particularly for children. I think that we should accept that the culture is kind of turning towards this idea like a sunflower. In the beginning, when people talked about affective intelligence, people said, oh my God, no, effective intelligence, effective AI, that's effective machines, that's terrible. But okay, it's effective, it's not emotional, that's okay if they call it effective. Now they call it emotional machines. I mean, you see that this word affective was used so they wouldn't use emotional so as not to keep people upset. Now they call it emotional machines. The culture moves, kind of turning towards where the culture is turning towards where technology is turning. And for people like me, that turning is of interest, but it also has really deep implications for what happens to children. So your question really has two parts. For me, it has two parts. I think we have to worry about children and the development of children dealing with objects, dealing with creatures and objects that don't have this interior life that they have, don't have this experience that they have, and that they don't know the difference. And also what happens to children when they live in environments that are not of the real. What is the balance of actually not just watching it on a screen, like watching a TV and being with your family and, talking about the movie, but really living your life in a world that doesn't have the consequences that real life has. And the reason that upsets me, I'm giving away my cards, but the reason that concerns me, and I don't think the thing to do is, to have a moratorium, but to have, but really to begin to talk about guidelines and to begin to talk about the deep implications, is that, I feel we're at a moment when we need to really concentrate on our planet, our democracy, our communities, our way of living with each other, the kinds of conversations that we're able to have in person, the most consequential conversations for our life together in communities, maybe that we've ever faced. And somehow we're focused on going someplace else with a whole different set of kinds of conversations that really will have no real world consequences. So when people grow up, when kids grow up knowing that they can be in conversations and take actions in a world where there are no, if I drop this cup, it's going to break. I think that's not the world that you want to have your child live in most of the time now. And so the idea that we're building a metaverse that's not just going to be, I'll play a little game and then I'll come back to the real world, but that's kind of where I'm going to work. That's where I'm going to go to school. In a world where you learn that you drop things and break things and literally there is no consequence. I don't think that's the world that we need now. I think we need a world, we need to train ourselves to think that the world is fragile and we can't be breaking things.
Well, sometimes it seems that technology has a mind of its own, and especially when there's money to be made in our capitalistic world. that it's going to be very hard to stop this this development of the metaverse. And I think the best that we can do is to have more discussion about what the dangers are. This has been very.
Alan, what about if people, if consumers just said, I don't want to live, I don't want to do that. I don't really, this is not appealing to me.
Well, so far the consumers have not voted that way. The consumers have wanted more and more technology, more and more smartphones, more connectedness to the internet. Thoreau said, the railroad, we don't ride the railroad rides us.
Yes.
That was, in 1860 or whenever. So yeah. That was the same thing that we're worried about right now. That's the same thing. Well, do you mind if I let our audience ask a few questions? We
have a number. But I would love to think. I would just love to think that people will go on will just go on this metaverse and say, this makes no sense to me.
Well, I hope that you're right.
Well, I'm interested in talking to people. I'm going to be studying this because this one, I think this one should be a pretty hard sell. As somebody who spent a lot of time in the metaverse, this one is a hard sell.
Yeah. So let me ask, I'm going to read a question to you.
Well, thank you, first of all, for your excellent questions.
Well, thank you for your excellent answers and thought-provoking. This is from an anonymous attendee. What experiences or aspects of life will always be better in person without technology?
Conversation.
I think that you've already answered that question. What aspects will benefit from technology? So what are the positive aspects of technology?
Oh, I think there are so many, medical science. Look, I'm able to go to teach my classes, to resume my life. I'm no longer up all night with flop sweats about dying and saying goodbye to my daughter on a screen because of this vaccine. I am no Luddite. I am very pro technology. I bless technology every day. I think we all have just lived through the miracle of what in an extraordinarily short space of time technology has done for all of us who are alive right now.
Yeah. And we stay alive longer because of antibiotics.
Yes. I'm just taking the thing. I'm just taking the thing that I'm, where I began was that I didn't want to talk to a robot about maybe dying from COVID. So I thought I'd end on, my gratefulness to technology for bringing us the vaccine. But everything, and the internet, look, this is a wonderful event. And I've had other books. I've been on book tours, and, it's wonderful to come to a book signing and to be there with people. It's an extraordinary experience, but it's also wonderful to be able to, meet people, have it recorded, have a greater reach, have Alan be able to be there, who's just the perfect person to talk to me. And, it's technology has given me the blessing of really having a very exciting experience with the Empathy Diaries and reaching a lot of people who I might never have reached. So that.
Here's another question from an anonymous attendee. Some journalists have written about how efforts to garner empathy, especially in the US, are sometimes overzealous or misplaced. and gives an example, giving airtime to extremists to try to understand their perspective. Where do you draw the line in your own life, or do you think it's worth it to hear everyone out?
It's a great question. I think it's important to understand where we are now. I think it's very important to understand where people are getting their disinformation, why people are drawn towards authoritarianism, why we live in a moment when so many Americans are drawn towards authoritarian figures. We are at an extraordinary moment in American society. That is very different from giving. So I think that there's a balance between understanding that disinformation and that pull towards authoritarianism, and saying it's a level playing field. Here's some information that isn't true. See what you think about it, because it's maybe it's kind of like you can have this or you can have the truth. It's it's for you to choose. Or here's somebody who believes a crazy thing. We're putting him out there as though what he believes or she believes is equally valid as somebody who believes something that's based on fact. So I think that understanding crazy or dangerous is important, but that's not the same as presenting it without context. So just presenting people who are lying to you is not the same as these people are lying to you. Now let's understand why they want to do that, because we really need to get to that. We can't just ignore the fact that people want to lie to you now. I hope that's an answer.
Yes, that's an answer. So here's a question from Jean-Paul Marie Justin. Do you consider the role of people on the spectrum as having an impact on the qualities that would be accessible for IT developers and IT users? Isn't lacking empathy part of the spectrum issues?
There's really very fascinating work about how to use technology in the for the experience of people on the spectrum. Some of that work is controversial. People feel that that the experience of people on the spectrum should be sort of what it is and kind of left to be what it is. But I co-taught a class at MIT with Roz Picard and Cynthia Brazil, in which they were introducing some of that very early interesting work where people on the spectrum were being helped to really focus their eyes to the eyes of their interlocutors and to have that experience. So I'm not here to judge that or to take a position on that, but I think that the existence of those technological enhancements, I think it's up to people on the spectrum and who and their advocates to look at that work and to make the decision for themselves. I think that's I think it's very personal, but I think it's a very interesting question.
Another question from an anonymous person. What skills in communication and connection have you seen deteriorate the most during your lifetime?
Empathy. And all the research is dramatic, insofar as we can measure empathy, which is very hard. The skills, for example, I'll give you an example. I'm interviewing a the ability to hold a conversation focused on the people in the conversation is now an extreme, you know, it's something that people almost need to practice. In interviewing for my last book, it was explained to me what the students I was interviewing, these were 18 to 21-year-olds, called the rule of three. And the rule of three was that if you're in a conversation, let's say with 6 people at dinner or 8 people at dinner, let's say in a dining room at a university, if 3 people were looking up and making eye contact in the conversation, you could look down at your phone. So the rule of three meant that there was a group conversation, but it was kind of like a round robin of people putting their heads up and down. Now, what's interesting about the rule of three is what kind of conversation is going to take place if people are looking up and down and checking in and out of the conversation. Because it's not no conversation, but it's not when I was in college, I lost my mother. The Empathy Diaries really it's a quest story for my father, this father who was taken away from me and who I end up finding again when I'm 26-year-old. My mother has died and I'm on a quest for him after she's died. I find him, I hire detectives, I seek him out. But it's also a story of my anger at my mother and my needing to come to terms with why she did that. And of course, it's kind of a mystery for why she left him. And then when I find him, I understand and I kind of return to her. And I had to talk about that a little when I was in college, when I was in graduate school with friends. I never would have been able to talk about that if I was in a conversation where people were like going like this, or talk about my mother's death, or talk about, you can't talk about anything really hard when people are doing that. So I think that when we bring our phones to a table, we have to remember that we change the nature of the conversation. We turn it into connection. We move it from conversation to connection, which is why I really, I have how-tos, don't bring them, there are sacred spaces. Don't bring a phone to the table. Don't bring the phone to the kitchen. Don't bring the phone to the car. Keep places. Don't worry about how much time you spend with your phone. Just don't bring them to places where you need to be able to talk about really your heart. So I think that because we have so much, we've given up so many of those places, that the thing that we've lost most is the capacity and the ease for, conversation and empathy, because it's in these conversations that empathy is born.
I would add one thing to your discussion of empathy there, in which the smartphone interferes with our inner life, and that is just walking out in the woods, for example, in nature. If you're looking at your smartphone connecting to your office, you're not really being present in the environment that you are. You're not having an unmediated experience with nature, and that's of course related to what you were saying, and not quite the same, because we're not talking about conversation between 2 people. We're talking about a conversation between you and the natural world,
or between you and yourself,
and that conversation is being interrupted by this piece of technology in your hand.
Absolutely.
Let me ask one more question, the last question, from Susan Lipman. Have either of you read Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun? And if yes, could you comment on the notion of artificial friends?
I've read it. Have you read it, Alan? Do you want to comment? Do you want to end this?
No,
I
go
already
ahead. Go ahead.
commented, sort of. Why don't
Go
you?
ahead.
Well, I've read it. I read it right away because it came out. It's kind of on my topic. It's in my wheelhouse. It came out right when my book came out, and I think that I'm in dialogue really with that book because I think he gives away the store. I think that he in a very interesting way, he is not critical enough of what's lost when your friend is artificial. I'm interested in writing about that. So I feel that my work is very much in dialogue with that book. I'm not saying that his robot isn't super brilliant, but I think that the question is about the artificial friend's inner life.
Yes. Well, you've spoken a lot about inner life and lived human experience, and you've made a pretty clear distinction between that and some of these artificial creations. Well, thank you, Sherry Turkle, for a wonderful and stimulating conversation. I hope that this qualifies in your book as a conversation.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Alan. You're wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. So I just want to start by saying thank you so much to Sherry and Alan for that really deeply fascinating conversation. I would also like to thank the audience here today, as your patronage is really what allows us to bring you programming like this, and we would not be able to continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please support Sherry, Turkle, and Politics and Prose by using the link, which we have posted a few times in the chat, to purchase the Empathy Diaries. Be sure to keep an eye on our website for our current event listings, as we have plenty of excellent events coming up and to attend virtually and hopefully in person very, very soon. So thank you so much again to Sherry and Alan for joining us today. Keep well read, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.